is agreed to. The burden is on Iran to prove to the world that its nuclear program will be exclusively for peaceful purposes.
What was concluded in Geneva last night is not a historic agreement. It's a historic mistake.
Israeli Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu criticizing the deal the U.S. and other world powers sealed with Iran overnight. And it's time now for our Sunday group. Syndicated columnist George Will, Julie Pays, who covers the White House for the Associated Press, Nina Easton of Fortune magazine, and Fox News political analyst Juan Williams. Well, Julie, good to have you here today because you have a fascinating story on the wires today. You report that the U.S. and Iran have been involved for the last year in secret, high-level talks. One, what was going on, and two, how big a role did those talks play in leading up to this weekend's agreement?
Well, this is a story that I've been working on with two great colleagues of mine, Matt Lee and Brad Clapper, since March. March is when we were first tipped off that the U.S. and Iran had been having a high-level meeting in Oman. And that meeting happened critically before Rouhani, the more moderate cleric, was elected. We subsequently learned that there were 4 other meetings that happened after Rouhani was elected over the course of this fall. And those are the meetings that really laid the groundwork for this agreement that we saw last night. It was in these meetings that some of the details were actually discussed between the U.S. and Iran, and that's the deal that actually was then brought to the P5 talks. And a lot of the allies were surprised in some way that this deal seemed to come together a little more quickly than maybe they expected, and that's in large part because these meetings had already happened.
All right, let's get to the deal. George, President Obama says it's an interim step to test Iran's intentions. They agree not to stop, but to cap their enrichment well below weapons-grade level. We agree to open the spigot and ease some of their sanctions. They end up with about $7 billion in extra money. What do you think?
Well, in his statement last night, there was a sentence that's absolutely surreal. He says,
the president.
The president. He said, for the first time in nearly a decade, we have halted the progress of the Iranian nuclear program. That implies that it has been halted for a decade, whereas we know it has been racing forward. Now the question is, will this small easing of the sanctions remain small? The New York Times, deep in its story this morning, quotes Robert Einhorn, who recently left the State Department and until he left was in charge of the enforcement of the sanctions. He says the following, in defense of this deal. He says, I think the sanctions won't erode as fast as some fear. He seems to be conceding the fact that they will indeed erode. I think 4 things are now clear, Chris. First, there will be no U.S. attack on our negotiating partner, the Iranians. That's off the table. Probably a good thing, but now formally off the table. Second, the president has said he is not going to contain a nuclear Iran. I think that will be our policy, is containing them, because I think they're going to get the bombs. Third, the big question is, what will Israel, abetted by Saudi Arabia, which is terrified of Iran, do at this point? And fourth, will the final reaction be the proliferation of nuclear weapons in the Middle East as the Saudis seek their own arsenal?
Juan, are you as supportive of this deal as George Will is?
I have a totally different view, which is, gosh, we've been estranged from the Iranians now since '79, so this is decades in which we have not spoken with them. To me, just the fact that we are able to sit, to talk, to at least get going, is a tremendous breakthrough for the United States and for our allies in the region. So you have an opportunity here, I think, to quiet the drums of war. Nobody wants this war, and that's where we were headed if we did not enter into some sort of opportunity to sit down and talk. So what you have here, it seems to me, is an opportunity to avert a war. I mean, and you have to put it in those stark terms, because Israel and the United States literally were going back and forth recently. Remember Benjamin Netanyahu, the prime minister, in front of the UN with his chart of that bomb. This is how fast they're growing. Well, for the moment, George, they have not stopped enrichment of uranium totally. But what they have done in the short term is to say we're not going to enrich it fully. And that means what they call dash time has been slowed by a month or a few more in terms of the Iranians being able to actually produce a nuclear weapon.
Nina, I mean, there are clearly risks on both sides. I mean, the risk for this deal is that Iran is able to continue enriching and remains just shy of, but on the path towards creation of a nuclear weapon. On the other side, there was the risk that this was going to end up in a war, and there are certainly downsides to that, a huge economic dislocation, a new wave of terrorism. How do you balance that?
Well, look, I'm just back from a week in Saudi Arabia, and the level of suspicion and mistrust of this White House cannot be underestimated, especially from your disclosures, Julie. That said, I have to say, if your end game is to limit Iran's ability to actually get a nuclear weapon and to do so without a military strike, and we know what that could, we don't know, the problem is we don't know what that could do, then at least this is an amount of progress. It is taking a very painful sanctions regime. And by the way, they came to the table because of this sanctions regime. It takes some of those sanctions off, leaves most of them on, and you know, we all often say the devil's in the details of an agreement. I think the devil's in what comes next, and watching it and making sure that there's follow through and that no more sanctions come off until there's more progress.
Let me ask you one question. You say you were in Saudi Arabia, because one of the concerns that George raises is that Saudi Arabia will now fear, well, it can't allow Iran to have a nuclear weapon. It's going to have to start a nuclear program. Any talk about that?
And that's, no, but that's the, I mean, obviously that's always the prospect out there. No, the concern, the immediate concern of the Saudis was these overtures that the White House has made towards Iran. And again, we now know that they go back even before this so-called more moderate regime. But again, you have to look at the options. There aren't any good options in this. What you have to do is see what you can do short of a military strike to keep Iran from getting its hands on a nuclear weapon. By the way, France was a skeptic of an earlier iteration of this, and they're on board now.
Okay, George, we have less than a minute left. What about the argument that, to whatever degree, the moderates are, if not in charge, they're the ones that are at the table at this point, and that if you don't deal with them, all you do is empower the hardliners, and things get even worse?
This is a dance we went through during the Cold War. We were constantly negotiating with ourselves in order to supposedly encourage the doves against the hawks in the Kremlin. A moderate in Iran is a very relative term at this point. And I see no reason to believe that after 30 years and intense sacrifices seeking nuclear weapons, Iran has suddenly decided that sanctions are too high a price to pay for this. Let me be clear to Juan. I'm very opposed to an attack on Iran, but I think it's time we face the fact they're going to be a nuclear power.
All right. On that happy note, we have to take a break here.